didn't believe that it was necessary for him to be sick or blind or deaf. And basically what they told me was that he didn't have enough vision to read, and he read because he didn't believe in being blind.
For years, the story of Rocky Dennis inspired both heartbreak and admiration, capturing global attention through resilience in the face of a rare condition. Yet before her passing, his mother, Florence Tullis, reportedly revealed truths that challenged the narrative many believed.
He started getting a lot of ear infections and sinus infections and sore throats. So when he was 2.5, we had his tonsils out, and the x-rays picked up an abnormality in the bone.
Her long-held silence gave way to claims of hidden struggles, difficult choices, and moments kept from public view. Those closest to the story say the revelations cast his life in a far more complex light. So, what did she finally share? And why did she wait so long? She refused to call it the end. Joshua doesn't believe in dying, and neither do I. It wasn't a whispered line pulled from grief. It was said plainly, almost calmly. And when she spoke about Rocky, she went even further. She described his passing as just another place to go. Not a tragedy, not a loss, not something stolen, just a place. Those words came from Florence Tullis, the woman the world thought it understood, the same woman portrayed on screen in Mask, the same mother who raised Roy Lee Dennis, the boy born on December 4th, 1961, in Glendora, California, who lived with one of the rarest bone disorders ever recorded. By the time of his diagnosis at UCLA Medical Center, doctors said only a handful of cases existed worldwide. They predicted he would be blind, severely disabled, and unlikely to survive beyond the age of 7. He lived until he was 16. And yet, when she spoke about his death on October 3, 1978, she did not frame it as a heartbreaking defeat. She did not describe a mother crushed under the weight of loss. She did not use the language people expected, the language of mourning, regret, or why me. Instead, she chose something that unsettled people far more than tears ever could. She chose certainty. To understand the impact of that, you have to pause and sit inside the discomfort of it. Society has a script for grieving mothers. They break. They question. They replay the final moments endlessly. But Florence Tullis did none of that publicly. She never suggested she would have done things differently. She never distanced herself from the philosophy that guided her parenting. In fact, she doubled down on it. Her belief was simple and unwavering. If a person could make themselves sick, they could make themselves well. It was an idea she formed long before Rocky's diagnosis, long before doctors delivered their timeline. And she applied it to him consistently. Through the headaches, the hospital visits, the relentless progression of craniodiaphyseal dysplasia. She believed strength was a choice. She believed perception shaped reality. She believed fear gave illness power. So when she said she and Joshua did not believe in dying, it was not poetic language. It was literal. Joshua Mason, her first son, would later die in 1987 at age 32 after being diagnosed with Kaposi's sarcoma during the height of the AIDS crisis. Even then, she held the same line. Death, to her, was not an ending. It was a transition. That worldview changes how you see everything. It reframes the final night of Rocky's life. It reframes her public comments about the film that told their story. It reframes the absence of visible regret. Was it a shield, a coping mechanism, or an unshakable conviction she carried to her own grave in November 2006? People who expected confession never got one. Those who waited for her to soften never heard it. What they heard instead was something far more complicated. A mother who refused to see her son as a victim, refused to see herself as tragic, and refused to let death have the final word. And that refusal is where the real tension begins. Even as the world expected confession or visible grief, Florence Tullis stood unmoved. Was her refusal a profound act of strength, a deliberate philosophy, or a conviction so absolute that it reshaped the very meaning of loss itself? Let's find out. The belief that never wavered. If she did not believe in dying, then everything about that final night begins to look different. By late September 1978, Roy Lee Dennis was 16 years old and visibly weaker. The disease that doctors at UCLA Medical Center once said would take him before age 7 had stretched his life nearly a decade beyond their prediction. But it had not disappeared. The abnormal bone growth, caused by craniodiaphyseal dysplasia, had continued its slow pressure against his skull. His headaches, which had shadowed him for years, were becoming more intense. In those last weeks, he was using a wheelchair more often. Everyone around him could see the toll. On the evening before his death, Rocky complained of another severe headache. This was not unusual in their home. Pain had long been part of the routine. And so Florence Tullis responded the way she always had. She told him to go to his room and make himself well. Those words were not spoken in anger. They were not careless. They were rooted in the philosophy she had lived by for years. She believed deeply that the mind held power over the body. From childhood, when Rocky suffered ear infections and sinus issues, through the shock of his diagnosis, she reinforced the same idea. You are not your illness. You are not your prognosis. If you can influence sickness, you can influence healing. That night, she followed the same script she had trusted for most of his life. Rocky went to his room. He never woke up. He died in his sleep on October 3, 1978, at home in Glendora, California. He was 16, only weeks away from 17. The boy who had been given a death sentence before first grade had outlived it by almost 10 years. There is another detail that unsettles people. At the time of his passing, his mother was not in the house. She was at her lawyer's office dealing with an illegal substance possession charge. The call came from her partner, Bernie Tullis, the man who inspired the character Gar in Mask. The version shown on screen portrayed her discovering her son herself, collapsing in raw grief. The reality was different. What makes this harder to examine is what did not happen afterward. She did not publicly say she wished she had done something else. She did not question whether telling him to make himself well had been enough. She did not reframe her philosophy. In interviews, she continued to stand by the belief that had shaped Rocky's confidence and independence. She never described it as a mistake. That consistency is where the tension lives. For some, it sounds like strength, a refusal to let fear define the story. For others, it feels complicated. When does belief empower, and when does it risk becoming the only tool in the room? She never offered an answer. She simply kept her position, steady and unchanged, even as the world debated it quietly. Amid unwavering conviction, tension quietly lingered. Was her steadfast belief a source of true strength, or had it become the only lens through which life, loss, and legacy could ever be understood, and questioned by none? Let's unravel more truth when the screen told a different story. If her philosophy never changed, neither did her honesty about what came next. By 1985, Rocky's story had reached millions through Mask, directed by Peter Bogdanovich and written by Anna Hamilton Phelan. Starring Cher as Florence "Rusty" Tullis and Eric Stoltz as Rocky, the film was widely praised as inspirational and heartfelt. Audiences wept, critics applauded, The mother at the center of it all was elevated into something close to heroic. But when Florence Tullis spoke about the film publicly, her tone was not celebratory. She called it a fairy tale. That word landed heavily. She had agreed to the adaptation, believing it would shine a light primarily on her son's courage. Rocky had been the one who endured the surgeries, the staring, the physical pain, the daily effort of living inside a body that did not cooperate. She imagined a story focused squarely on him. Instead, when the film arrived in theaters, she realized it had split the spotlight. Her character became central. Her flaws were softened, her chaos shaped into something cinematic and almost glamorous. She acknowledged that Cher portrayed her well. She even said the depiction captured her personality. But what unsettled her was the shift in focus. The narrative had become not only about a boy with a rare disease, but also about a rebellious, leather jacket-wearing mother navigating love, addiction, and defiance. In shaping the story for mass audiences, Hollywood had inevitably streamlined it. Years of struggle were compressed. Complex timelines were tightened. Real life became structured drama. Then there were the omissions. Joshua Mason, her first son, did not appear in the film at all. His presence in the family story was erased. At the time the movie was released, Joshua was alive and living in San Francisco. Within a year, he would be diagnosed with Kaposi's sarcoma during the height of the AIDS crisis and later died in 1987 at age 32. Yet, in the cinematic retelling, Rocky existed almost in isolation, as though he were her only child. That absence was not minor. It reshaped the emotional landscape of the family. The final night was also altered. On screen, the mother discovers Rocky's body herself, a moment of direct confrontation between parent and loss. In reality, she was at her lawyer's office dealing with an illegal substance charge when the call came from Bernie Tullis. The difference may seem small, but it changes the emotional framing. One version centers her private grief. The other reveals the messy context of real life, continuing even at the edge of tragedy. Even her illegal substance use was softened. In interviews, she pushed back on the idea that she used substances solely because she was overwhelmed by Rocky's illness. She insisted it was part of her lifestyle long before and separate from his diagnosis. The film suggested pain-driven coping. She described something more blunt and unapologetic. So when she called the movie a fairy tale, the question lingered. What exactly had been transformed? Was it the structure of events? The portrayal of addiction? The absence of Joshua? The timing of Rocky's death? Or the shaping of her into a figure easier to love than to question? The version shown in theaters comforted audiences. The version she described was harder, less polished, and far more complicated. And that difference begins to suggest that the Hollywood narrative may not have only honored her, it may have protected her from deeper scrutiny. The Hollywood version of her story comforted audiences, yet the reality she described was harsher, more complex. Did the polished narrative honor her, or did it deliberately shield her from scrutiny the public would never see? Keep watching. The Price of a Story. If the film felt polished and incomplete, the reason behind it was far more personal than many realized. When Mask was released in 1985, it became a box office success, earning more than $48 million in theaters. The emotional story of Roy Lee Dennis reached audiences across America. His courage became inspiration. His mother became unforgettable. But behind the applause and ticket sales was a much smaller number that rarely gets the same attention: $15,000. That was the amount paid to Florence Tullis for the rights to her son's story. On the surface, the contrast is jarring. Millions made, thousands paid. It invites suspicion. It invites anger. It invites the idea that someone profited unfairly from a family's pain. But the truth behind that payment complicates the picture. By the time the film entered production, her first son, Joshua Mason, was facing his own crisis. Living in San Francisco, Joshua was a writer, openly gay during a time when that still carried heavy stigma. In 1986, he was diagnosed with Kaposi's sarcoma, a cancer widely associated with AIDS during the height of the epidemic. Treatments were expensive. Fear was everywhere. Families were scrambling for options in a medical landscape that felt uncertain and urgent. According to multiple accounts, most of the $15,000 Florence received for Mask did not go toward comfort, fame, or lifestyle. It went toward Joshua's medical bills. She did not sell Rocky's story to build wealth. She sold it to try to keep her other son alive. That decision changes the emotional equation. What might look like exploitation becomes sacrifice. She handed over the narrative of one son in an effort to save another. It was not a transaction made in celebration. It was made under pressure. And yet, here is the painful irony. Joshua does not appear in the film at all. The audience that cried for Rocky never met the older brother who was fighting his own battle. He was written out of the cinematic version entirely. In theaters across the country, viewers watched a mother who seemed to have only one child, as though the family's story began and ended with Rocky. In reality, Florence would lose both of her sons. Rocky died at 16 on October 3, 1978. Joshua died in 1987 at 32. One son became the face of inspiration. The other became a quiet absence in the background of that legacy. So the $15,000 becomes more than a paycheck. It becomes a symbol, a number tied to urgency, to illness, to a mother making decisions in real time without knowing how the future would unfold. She sacrificed control of the story. She watched it be reshaped. She saw one son celebrated and the other omitted. And in the middle of that, she carried grief that the public only partially understood. The narrative was never simple. It was layered with survival, omission, and choices made under impossible circumstances. The $15,000 tells more than a story. It marks urgency, sacrifice, and impossible choices. But did Florence Tullis's surrender of control preserve her family's legacy, or conceal deeper truths the world was never meant to see? Stay glued. The contradictions that defined her. To understand the choices she made, you have to understand the woman making them. And Florence "Rusty" Tullis was never simple. Long before Hollywood cameras arrived, before medical headlines and courtroom visits, she was a Brooklyn girl born on May 29, 1936. Raised in a Jewish household in New York, the daughter of a truck driver, she developed her edge early. She was sharp, outspoken, and unwilling to bend easily. By 13, she had been expelled from junior high school for truancy. By 14, she was experimenting with marijuana. At 15, she left school entirely and worked as a hoochie-coochie dancer at Coney Island. She moved through life quickly, without apology. At 17, she married a truck driver named Tommy Mason and gave birth to her first son, Joshua. That marriage did not last. She eventually remarried Roy Dennis and moved to California, where on December 4, 1961, she gave birth to Roy Lee Dennis in Glendora. Life shifted again when Rocky was diagnosed at UCLA Medical Center with craniodiaphyseal dysplasia, a condition so rare that only a handful of cases had ever been recorded. Doctors spoke in grim timelines. She answered with defiance. But even as she fought schools and specialists to keep Rocky in mainstream classrooms in Covina and Glendora, she was also a full member of a motorcycle group known as the Turks. These were not weekend hobbyists. They were loyal, rough around the edges, and tightly bonded. Her partner, Bernie Tullis, was part of that world. Leather jackets and loud engines were not costumes. They were her community. Her illegal substance use was not hidden. In interviews, she resisted any attempt to frame it purely as coping with Rocky's illness. She said plainly that she partied, and illegal substances were part of that lifestyle. She did not cast herself as a secret victim spiraling in private. She owned it. That honesty unsettled people who preferred a cleaner narrative. And yet, the same woman who rode motorcycles and lived boldly would later move to San Francisco and embrace Buddhism. After Rocky's death in 1978 and Joshua's in 1987, she sought something quieter. She worked as a counselor, helping addicts. She planned to volunteer with the Shanti Project, supporting people facing terminal illness during the AIDS crisis. The edges did not disappear, but they softened in different ways. She once said she always believed she was perfectly normal, and that the rest of the world was nuts. It was not said jokingly. It was her lens. To her, strength meant refusing to accept labels others tried to place on her son. It meant challenging school administrators who doubted his intelligence. It meant pushing back against doctors who set limits. It meant living loudly in a society that often preferred silence. Was that chaos? Or was it discipline in a form most people did not recognize? She was not tidy. She was not conventional. But she was consistent. The same defiance that kept Rocky in mainstream classrooms also kept her from apologizing for her lifestyle. The same refusal to accept a death sentence for her child also kept her from softening her worldview when critics questioned her. She was not easy to contain, not by doctors, not by filmmakers, and not by public opinion. And that complexity continues to challenge anyone trying to place her neatly into a single category. Was Florence Tullis's defiance chaos or disciplined conviction? Her unwavering consistency shaped Rocky's life, resisted public expectation, and challenged perception, leaving one question. Was her strength a rare insight or an unyielding refusal to bend to the world's judgment? Let's unravel the details. The strength no one expected. For all the focus on his mother's contradictions, it is easy to forget who this story was supposed to be about. Strip away the headlines, the courtroom visits, the biker jackets, and the Hollywood edits, and what remains is a teenage boy who refused to see himself as fragile. Roy Lee Dennis was born on December 4, 1961, in Glendora, California. Doctors at UCLA Medical Center warned that his condition would likely steal his sight, limit his mind, and end his life before he reached 7. Instead, he entered classrooms that were not built to accommodate him and insisted on belonging there. In Covina and Glendora, school officials initially doubted whether he could handle mainstream classes. His facial bones had thickened and expanded due to craniodaphysal dysplasia. His appearance drew stares. His medical file was intimidating, but academically, he proved them wrong. He graduated from Sandberg Junior High with honors. He was voted best buddy, most good-natured, and friendliest camper. Those were not sympathy titles. They were reflections of how he treated people. He even turned tutoring into a small business. When classmates needed help, he charged $3 an hour. He negotiated that rate himself. There was something quietly bold about that. It showed he did not see himself as someone to be pitied. He saw himself as someone who had value. He loved learning in ways that went beyond textbooks. He memorized the night sky, identifying constellations with precision. While others focused on his face, he looked upward, mapping stars. There is something symbolic in that image. A boy told he might not see clearly, committing the heavens to memory. At summer camp, he fell in love with a blind girl. She could not see his physical differences, and he did not need her to. Their connection was built on conversation and humor, not appearance. In a world that often reacted to his looks before hearing his voice, that mattered. When doctors offered surgery that might alter his features, he asked a simple question. If my face changes, who will I see in the mirror? It was not a refusal born of fear. It was an identity. He chose himself as he was. Music also shaped him. He was a devoted fan of Bruce Springsteen. The lyrics, the energy, the sense of struggle and resilience resonated deeply. When the film adaptation later replaced Springsteen's songs without approval, it struck a nerve not just artistically, but personally. It felt like another detail of his real life being rewritten. Through it all, he maintained humor. He answered strangers' questions directly. He confronted stares with wit. The disease was real. The pain was real. The headaches were relentless. But so was his presence. In many ways, he carried emotional steadiness that unsettled even adults around him. While others debated prognosis and philosophy, he simply lived. He made friends. He fell in love. He studied. He planned. He existed fully inside the years he was given. For a boy once expected not to survive childhood, that quiet strength reshapes the narrative. The illness was visible. The courage was internal. And often, it was he who seemed the least fragile in the room. And for a boy predicted to vanish before adolescence, his quiet strength defied expectation. But if courage resided silently within him, who truly shaped the story? The world around him, or the unyielding resolve he carried alone? Stay tuned. When even the soundtrack changed. If Rocky's strength was real and deeply personal, then the details that shaped his world mattered more than they seemed. One of those details was music. He was not casually fond of it. He loved Bruce Springsteen. The lyrics, the urgency, the sense of fighting against limits spoke to him. For a teenager navigating pain and public stares, those songs were not background noise. They were part of how he understood himself. When Mask went into production under director Peter Bogdanovich, the original cut reportedly featured Springsteen's music woven throughout. It fits. It matched the tone of resilience and restless determination that defined Rocky's life. But before the film reached theaters in 1985, something changed. Universal Pictures was unable to secure the rights from Columbia Records for the Springsteen tracks. Without informing Bogdanovich in advance, the studio replaced the songs with music by Bob Seger. To many viewers, it may have felt like a minor adjustment, a soundtrack swap, a practical decision tied to licensing and contracts. To those closer to the story, it was more than that. Florence Tullis publicly commented that she did not believe Rocky even knew who Bob Seger was. It was a brief statement, but it carried weight. The songs that had shaped her son's inner world were removed, replaced with something commercially workable but personally disconnected. Another layer of reality had been adjusted. Bogdanovich was furious. He later filed a lawsuit seeking $19 million, claiming the studio violated his final cut privilege by altering the music without his approval. The dispute became part of the film's behind-the-scenes history. For nearly 2 decades, audiences watched a version of the story that did not fully reflect the director's original vision. It was not until 2004 that the director's cut DVD restored the Springsteen songs. By then, Rocky had been gone for more than 25 years. Joshua had been gone since 1987. Florence herself was nearing the end of her life. The music returned, But time had already moved forward. The soundtrack controversy might seem small compared to illness and loss, yet symbolically it speaks volumes. If even the music that meant something to Rocky could be replaced for practical reasons, what else could be reshaped? Timelines were compressed, characters were omitted, addiction was softened, death was dramatized. The pattern becomes difficult to ignore. Each alteration may have been understandable on its own. Films require pacing, studios require agreements, audiences expect structure. But piece by piece, the raw edges of a complicated life were rounded. Rocky's story was meant to inspire, and it did. Yet, the very elements that made him specific, his favorite songs, his real environment, the messy details of his family, were filtered through decisions that favored narrative clarity over lived texture. When the restored version finally brought Springsteen back into the film, it felt less like a correction and more like an acknowledgement, an admission that authenticity had been compromised, even if unintentionally. If the soundtrack could be rewritten once, it leaves a lingering question about the broader story, not as an accusation, but as an observation. How much of what the public embraced as truth was shaped by necessity, and how much of Rocky's real world remained just out of frame? Even with Springsteen's songs restored, the question lingers. How much of Rocky's story was truly lived, and how much was reshaped by circumstance, leaving the real life behind the camera just out of reach? Riding with certainty. Even after decades of upheaval, Florence Tullis carried her life with a clarity few could understand. By the early 2000s, she had settled in San Francisco, a city that matched her restless spirit, yet offered space for quiet reflection. There, she embraced Buddhism, not as a fleeting interest, but as a framework for living, a way to meet hardship with calm observation rather than despair. She spent her days counseling addicts, guiding people through chaos, much like she had navigated her own life. She had plans to volunteer with the Shanti Project, supporting those facing terminal illness during the height of the AIDS crisis, continuing a pattern of facing life's most painful truths head-on while refusing sentimentality. Yet even in these later years, the edges of her life remained sharp. On October 14, 2006, Florence mounted her motorcycle, an instrument of freedom she had relied on for decades. The road, her companion as much as the engine beneath her, carried her along Montebello streets with the ease of familiarity. But fate intervened. A tire detached unexpectedly, and the vehicle threw her into sudden, brutal violence. The crash left her with broken legs and a punctured lung. An infection quickly complicated her injuries. She was 70 years old, a survivor of loss, scandal, and relentless public scrutiny, now confronted with the fragility she had always refused to acknowledge in others. Through it all, her attitude did not waver. She never asked, "Why me?" She never pleaded for understanding. She never framed herself as a victim. Even faced with mortal injury, Florence Tullis remained consistent, a reflection of the philosophy that had defined her life. Her son Rocky's death had been just another place to go, and she never recast it as a tragedy, never softened the edges, never recanted her methods or beliefs. Strength, to her, was not performative. It was a choice, a constant that guided her through heartbreak, the chaos of Hollywood, the judgment of society, and now her own final days. Weeks passed as Florence fought her injuries, but the infection and trauma proved insurmountable. On November 11, 2006, she died in Montebello, California, at 70 years old. The world had witnessed a mother who defied expectation, a woman whose life had been anything but conventional, yet never reckless in her own mind. She had survived tragedies, courtroom battles, and the public's gaze, and she departed as she had lived, steadfast, unwavering, unrepentant. There were no tearful confessions. There were no apologies. There was no final act of rewriting or reshaping her story to fit what others wanted to see. Even in her final moments, the essence of Florence Tullis remained intact. Her story, intertwined with the brilliance and fragility of her son Rocky, and shadowed by the absence of Joshua, closed on a note of certainty rather than regret. She did not seek comfort from those around her, nor did she offer it in conventional ways. Her life, like her last ride, was lived deliberately, a series of choices marked by honesty, defiance, and an unshakable commitment to seeing the world and her experiences exactly as they were. In that steadfastness lies the final, unsettling truth. Florence Tullis never bent to expectation, never softened the narrative, and never allowed grief to dictate her identity. So what do you think made her story so unsettling? Her defiance, her refusal to grieve, or the way she refused to soften Rocky's life for the world? We'd like to hear your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.